Hope you're all doing well today. My name is Tony Mathias, and I'm the Marketing Manager for the Political Science List at Oxford University Press. At the Department of Oxford University and as a nonprofit higher education publisher, Oxford University Press is uniquely situated to offer the highest scholarship at the best possible prices in print and digital formats. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I also want to thank Dr. Alan Gitelson for taking time out of his schedule to lead our discussion. Dr. Gitelson is a professor of political science at Loyola University, and he received his PhD from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. He's written a number of books and scholarly articles and is a former member of the American Political Science Association Standing Committee on Education and Professional Development. He's a frequent guest commentator on radio and television, speaking on topics including campaign and elections, campaign financing, political parties, the media, and interest groups. He is also the lead author on Oxford University Press's American Government, Myths and Realities, which also includes co-authors Robert Dudley and Melvin Dubnick. Before we get started, we're going to mute everyone on the line except for Alan so we don't have any issues with background noise. At the end of the session, we'll have a question-answer session, so keep in mind that we'll be able to answer your questions at that time. You'll also notice on the control panel that there's a question box. So feel free to type in any questions and comments at any point during the talk, and we can address them at that time. So without further ado, we're going to kick things off. So over to you, Dr. Gitelson.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon on this webinar to discuss a topic that obviously draws a lot of attention for those of us who are teaching in political science around this time of year, and that is the 2016 elections. There's a subtext to this presentation, and that is really why we're doing this in 2015. Roughly a year away from the first primaries and caucuses, and indeed, when you think about it, some 20 months in advance of the election. So why do we talk about the 2016 elections with our students now? Indeed, that question that I'm really raising is this: why talk to these students now about an event really in which is in considerable flux? To some extent, as I indicate on this first PowerPoint, this may be considered a silly exercise, one really that is futile, with few ends that we can wrap up really this early in March, a full year ahead of the primaries. On the other hand, all of you are listening in, and certainly in my case, my teaching an introductory course in American government and another course on parties and elections, that I think about this frequently. What can I say to my students? What I think I can do, and I think what we all can do regarding the teaching of American government particularly, is that our students can begin to, as I indicate, frame the complexity of the election process early on, at the same time recognizing that it's in constant flux. So while in some sense it might be an exercise that is somewhat futile, and I'll be talking about that very shortly, at the same time I really think there's an end to our work, and that is obviously to give a complex issue some framing, and to also indicate that there are constant changes going on. What drives this early attention to the election starting so early on? Well, certainly 20 months in advance is a long time ahead of a particular event. But it's one really that increasingly we see is necessary in terms of the modern campaign. Let me suggest to you a number of reasons why this early start occurs. First of all, candidates declare very quickly, very early on, their candidacy. How many of us have had students that have come in, we've had a discussion with them during class or after class in which they indicated that at some point they wanted to be a U.S. Senator some years down the line. We have a governor in Illinois right now where I'm broadcasting from, Governor Bruce Rauner, just elected this past November, and from every indication from individuals I've talked in Springfield and other colleagues from around the state, Governor Rauner is very much interested in focusing really on the 2020 presidential election. There are other reasons clearly why the campaign process starts so early. One is the increasing competitiveness of the primary system. This is true in presidential elections, it's true in senatorial elections, it's true in House elections, although less, in some ways, most importantly in the House races. There are 435 seats in the House of Representatives, generally speaking, in any given year, only about 30 to 40 of those are really competitive in terms of election. It's in the primaries that a great deal of the action goes on in terms of the House of Representatives. And this is true in the Senate, and as we shall see in the discussion of 2016, it's true in the presidential elections relative particularly to the Republican Party. There are other reasons really why the strife starts so early. One is the 24/7 marathon that exists relative to campaign financing. In 2014 election, the 2014 election that we saw completed a little over less than a year ago, my gosh, fairly recently, was the most expensive midterm election that we've seen. It ran about $3.77 billion. And what was interesting about this particular election is that it relied on many fewer contributors. In fact, there was a decline of about 11% contributors between 2010 and 2014 in terms of off-year elections. That means that candidates had to rely on fewer donors to their campaigns, but they also had to start also very early. 2012, we saw about $6.5 billion spent on the election. At the presidential level, that was a little over, well, close to $4 billion, and at the congressional level, about $3.5 billion. Presidential campaigns also are no longer federally funded. I say that actually not in terms of the reality of the campaigns. There's still federal funding if you wanted to run your campaign for the presidency, both in the primaries and the general elections. But in terms of the reality, it's no longer relevant to the leading candidates in the general election, and frequently in the primaries as well. Individual candidates running for the presidency have to raise funds, enormous funds, very early on. They avoid public financing because they do not want to limit the amount of money they can spend on a campaign. This is an incredibly complex issue, I think, for our students. In some ways, for me, it's the most difficult. Campaign financing is the most difficult to explain. But pretty much in 2008, John McCain, who took public financing, got about $85 million to spend on that particular campaign, 2008. President Obama chose to publicly fund his campaign and thus grossly outspent McCain in that election. This is the signal for was the signal for the 2012 presidential election, and it certainly is going to be for the 2016 election. In effect, money is going to be spent independent of any kind of federal funding. We have, in effect, as I indicate, the death of federal financing for presidential elections unless there are significant changes made in the law. There are other reasons why individuals start their campaigns much earlier, and they're all again related under this general topic of campaign financing. I've listed on this PowerPoint slide a number of cases that have been critical really to changing the nature of campaign financing in the United States, at least at the presidential level. Citizens United is a case that most of us are familiar with. It basically opened the floodgates, allowing the businesses and unions to contribute from their own funds to political campaigns. But there are several other important campaigns that you may want to direct, or rather Supreme Court cases that you might want to direct to your students. One of them certainly is Davis v. the Federal Election Commission, which struck down the millionaires rule. That was a rule that allowed candidates in Senate and House races to spend more money on a campaign if their opponent was raising contributions through his own means. He was a millionaire or she was a millionaire, and thus it was felt that there was an imbalance in the campaign. Very quickly, a number of the other cases include the Federal Election Commission versus the Wisconsin Right to Life, lifting restrictions on corporate and union advertising in the weeks before an election. Randall v. Sorrell, overturn of Vermont low limits on campaign contributions and spending law. And much more recently, McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, it struck down the overall caps on contributions to as many candidates as one wanted to contribute to. These are cases that, while one does not necessarily have to explain in tremendous detail to our students, really in some ways drive at and suggest really one of the reasons why early campaigns take place. And in 2016, why they're starting so early and why they will continue to start early. And that is the financial floodgates have been opened. People can raise money much more easily than they have been able to raise in the past. There are also, under this general point of financing, pre-donor contributions. This is an interesting component of the election process, and one that's just cropped up recently, and individuals have to think about. The pre-donor contributions occur really before candidates make their official designation as a candidate for the President of the United States. And in some unusual factors that have contributed to this has been the availability, particularly of PAC money, a lot of PAC money very early on. In 2012, for example, Newt Gingrich got a single PAC donation of about $15 million from Sheldon Adelstein and his family. Today, one of the early leaders in campaign raising, money-raising campaign funds is Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush has done something unusual. He's put a $1 million limit for the first 100 days of this pre-donor period, before he actually makes his announcement officially. What is the end product of this? Candidates are increasingly raising money earlier and earlier, something that I emphasized earlier in my comments and that I emphasize now. And subsequently, campaigns have to start much earlier. There are at least two other factors that I just quickly would like to mention that have an impact on the early start of campaigns. One of them is the lining up of consultants and advisors. You saw this particularly this past year by Senator Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in terms of her campaign very early on in the process, beginning really as early as 2013. She started paying for and lining up the individuals who would serve as campaign consultants to her in a broad section of areas, relative areas, from the media to campaign financing. Why would you want to do this, and why would you want to do it early? Basically because, one, it's a message to those who might want to challenge you. Look, I'm getting the best people possible, and I'm going to line them up now. And the second point really is that you lock those individuals in. In effect, you make them unavailable to other individuals or prospective candidates. And this is an important point when we think about it, because there's a limited amount of talent and a limited amount of experience out there. Certainly enough to go around to all of the candidates, but the best and the brightest get captured and picked up very, very quickly. And in order to do that and ensure that you have the best and the brightest in terms of consultants and advisors, you have to start early in doing that. The final point that I'd like to make relative to why we have this early kind of frenzy is actually using that word again and talking about the media frenzy. The media begins to start to report on campaigns as early as possible. I'm going to be coming back to the role of the media in a little while, but it's a media-hungry media frenzy in which television, cable, networks, indeed newspapers and magazines fill their pages really with all kinds of stories about the campaigns. These topics really are, for the media, often very easy to report on. They suggest controversy. There's an old adage in the media covering the politics in general, but also in politics, both politics and the general news, that if it bleeds, it leads. And frequently, campaigns have a lot of bleeding that goes on during the process leading up to the actual election. Thus, the media is anxious to start the process as early as possible. I guess the ultimate question, or at least one of the questions that I want to raise is this all crazy? The first part of that comment that I made at the very beginning of this webinar. Well, yes, in a sense it is. We spend billions of dollars on campaigns at the federal level and also at the state and local level. And thus, there's a certain amount of craziness in the idea that all of this money has to be raised, and it has to be raised early on. There have been estimates that indicate that in a competitive Senate race, U.S. Senate race, for example, an individual is elected to the U.S. Senate. He or she is running for re-election 6 years later. In a competitive race, that individual may have to raise, on average, anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000 a week in order to deal with a competitive election 6 years away, in which literally the campaign may cost millions of dollars. I think you can argue that this is all crazy in some sense, but in another general sense, we're simply arguing really that the process really is just filled with issues that make us question why we have to start this process so early and why so much money has to be spent. I have a caveat here, though. We spend a lot of money on a lot of things, and Valentine's Day is a good example. This past year, close to $19 billion, yes, you heard me correctly, about $19 billion was spent on Valentine's. of Valentine's Day a little less than a month ago. In fact, we spend on average roughly about $700 million on Valentine's Day for presents for our pets. On Halloween in 2012, about $8 billion was spent. It went down a little bit the following year to about $7 billion, but on average, adults are spending roughly about $750 per person on this particular holiday. I can get into many other things and say, you know, Procter & Gamble's, for example, their advertising budget runs roughly about $3 billion a day. The Super Bowl advertisement for 30 seconds runs about $4 billion plus, and in 2016 it's estimated to go over the $5 million. Did I say billion? I meant $5 million for a 30-second advertisement. In 2012, TV ads, total TV ads ran close to $140 billion. And 30 seconds on the Oscars costs about $1.9 million. Why say these things? In some sense, to try and keep some balance regarding the issue of money. We spend a lot of money in a presidential year. We may spend $4 billion to $6 billion, increasingly $6.5 billion in 2012. Lots of money. The focus, I think, for our students should be, indeed, that it is a lot of money, but much more on the focus of who's contributing it and how much money is being given by a single individual. We spend an awful lot of money on a lot of other things in life, and sometimes it's important and interesting to compare and get some balance by saying that Procter & Gamble's, for example, spends about $3 billion a year advertising its products, and we're talking about $6.5 billion in 2012 for a election cycle, which we can consider going for anywhere from 2 to 4 years. There are other factors that I want to briefly talk about relative to this whole issue of whether this is a crazy environment or not. One of them is the primaries and how relevant they are and important they are. They're certainly important, they certainly are relevant, but relative, again, to wanting to get a very early start. I was just reading the newspapers today, and in New Hampshire this weekend, Jeb Bush is going to be there, Scott Walker is going to be there, former Governor Perry of Texas is going to be there, and in fact, individuals will be making many trips to New Hampshire and to Iowa, already have made many, many trips. It is all kind of crazy that this attention focuses basically very early on and very often on two states that, one Iowa, one New Hampshire, that are not necessarily representative of the general population. Think about it. The Iowa primary will be held about a year from now, a little less than a year from now, on a cold winter night. The caucus itself, the Iowa caucus, will attract fewer people and populate the city of Stamford, Connecticut. That is less than 120,000 individuals. The Iowa caucus is 99% white and far more rural and evangelical than the Republicans nationally. And picking the winners is not so good, really, in a state like Iowa. If that was the case, or for that matter in New Hampshire, if that was the case, if these people who did well in these early primaries and early caucuses, particularly Iowa and New Hampshire, were reflective of what is to come in terms of victories at the end of the election process, then we'd be talking about President Mike Huckabee or President Rick Santorum. This is a very costly process. A lot of money is spent on primaries and caucuses, and in order, once again, to come back to our theme, whether it makes sense to be talking about this in 2015 is only in light of the fact that money has to be raised very early on. Is it crazy relative to the polls? Do early leaders mean anything in terms of the polls that are going on? I track polls. You may want to do this also if you don't already through outlets like Real Politics, which provide running polls that exist on the presidency. We're taking polls, and for the most part, there's really little expectation that the polls that we have this early on are meaningful at all. Early leaders, it's a very mixed results regarding Republicans and Democrats. For example, an examination of midterm presidential polling since 1984 indicates that surveys conducted from the day after the preceding presidential vote to the day before the midterm shows that while early polls are not determinative, they're not necessarily meaningless, but for both Republican and Democratic parties, pre-midterm polls have generally guessed only about 50% of the field of candidates correctly. So often these early polls that we pay a tremendous amount of attention to exclude really about 50% of the population of candidates that will generally that will end up getting into the picture, into the mix. Now, indeed, they do generally include the eventual winner. But and it is important to get involved in the pre-primary, the polling, what we sometimes call the invisible primary, because these events lay the groundwork very early on for raising money, for getting party support, and campaign infrastructure. And indeed, the better that you do in the polls, the better that you have a chance early on of being able to go to potential fundraisers and say, look, it's a year ahead of time or it's 2 years ahead of time. I've been able to, in a sense, raise an awful lot of money. You know, you should support me because I can do better in the first primaries if I have more money to finance my campaign. Once again, I point to Real Clear Politics as an example of this kind of frenzy, in some ways a media frenzy, to report on the polls. I was looking at a series of polls that were reported by Real Clear Politics starting on February 18th. And on February 18th, what Real Clear Politics does is look at a synopsis of polls that have been taken in a variety of different outlets. And polls on February 18th of this year had Huckabee leading Bush by 17% to 12%. Not only is that unlikely to stand up, or it's less likely to stand up, but we're talking about only a 17% to 12% comparison. On February 23rd, the polls were indicating that Cruz was leading Scott Walker, by 20% to 12% as a leading candidate. And we can go through other polls that exist and take place and really, in a sense, come back and say, this does not make sense. These early polls are not going to be telling us an awful lot. And they don't tell us an awful lot, really, in terms of the eventual outcome. As I said, it's important to get started early on, and in terms of the campaign process, the key factor is raising money, and polls, when a candidate looks good in polls, is an important tool for raising money. For Democrats, however, the early front leaders really failed to win the nominations in the polls. If you look at comparisons starting in 1984 to 2008, fundamentally, really, the front leaders in the polls for the Democrats really have not turned out to be the eventual winners. It's somewhat closer and more predictable in the context of Republican races for one reason or another, but whatever the case is, it's not very useful in the end. So it's part of this basically crazy start to an election many months, many years before the actual election. Again, I'm keeping in mind, really, what are we teaching our students right now that's going to be useful to them when we enter the election process? And thus far, I'm suggesting, looking at these particular variables, that they all indicate that we can't really teach our students an awful lot. Early polls are not very useful. The primaries and the preparation for the primaries themselves often aren't very useful and don't necessarily predict the eventual winners. Money, the amount of money you spend is getting more complex in the sense that everybody seems to is trying to have fair equity relative to the amount of money they go into a campaign, but nevertheless, in order to get there, you've got to raise the funds earlier. I will also just let me close in terms of this craziness on two factors that are important. One, again, is coming back to this question of media and the feeding frenzy. The fact of the matter is that these early efforts at covering trips this weekend, for example, by Bush and others to the state of New Hampshire will be covered very closely by the media. To what end? Basically, simply, for the most part, to see if a gaffe comes about or something that's newsworthy, meaning that something happens that attracts us, and generally it's not necessarily the speech or the content of the speech, but something that was flawed about the campaign this past weekend. Media frenzy is really interesting. There's a wonderful article by Chris Hayes a number of years ago in The Nation that talked about what it was like to cover, for example, the New Hampshire primary, and he talks about the important tools that were necessary: a rental car, a GPS, and the ability to get around as quickly as possible to go to literally dozens of meetings as a reporter covering it. It didn't matter if you knew an awful lot about what was going on in the primaries. The major point, as Chris Hayes reports it from the observation of news reporters, is that you had to be part of the pack. You couldn't make a mistake. You didn't want to have to make a mistake and have your editor yell at you for not understanding a particular issue or problem. what Chris Hayes basically said was everybody tried, all of the reporters tried, talked to each other mostly about how they felt about the campaign and tried to replicate what other reporters were doing. And this doesn't make an awful lot of sense. It doesn't give voters an awful lot of options, even early on, in terms of talking about the differences between candidates. I'm not going to talk about super PACs very much right here. I'm going to talk about those very shortly, but the bottom line is that part of it is the craziness is all of this crazy, centers also around the increasing role of super PACs, political action committees that are taking on major function and major role in the campaign process. We'll come back to that. Let's take a quick look at 2016. On the Democratic side, this is a pretty easy look. What it looks like right now is that the inevitability of Hillary Clinton. We certainly have a number of other individuals who are talked about. We sometimes refer to the media as the chattering class, and the chattering class have thrown in any one of a number of other names, as have actually the individuals whose names appear. Certainly we know that Elizabeth Warren's name has come up, Vice President Joe Biden's name has come up. He may at one point have been a serious contender, unlikely now unless something happens with the Clinton campaign. Bernie Sanders is an individual who's indicated that he might very well challenge Clinton in some other primaries. Jim Webb, former senator from Virginia, and Martin O'Malley from Maryland, also individuals who have indicated their interest in the presidency. Webb, for example, has it's called a pre-campaign committee, an exploratory committee. But the bottom line is that if you look at the opinion polls, Hillary Clinton is far ahead this early point in time. That's where the polls become important this early on, a year ahead of the campaign. Ms. Clinton can point to the fact that she's got this big lead, and individuals are going to find it very difficult to overcome that lead. Looking at the Republicans, the process is a bit harder. In fact, it's the hard part. Charlie Cook, who is a fairly well-known political commentator, has set up a number of categories of candidates that are likely to announce or may announce for the Republican nomination. He calls the establishment group individuals he regards really as who are part of the traditional Republican establishment: Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, and Carly Fiorina. Fiorina, you may remember, is the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, as four possible candidates from the established group, traditional Republicans. It doesn't mean that Carly Fiorina her name is on this list, that she may be a serious candidate. But as I've suggested already, it's very early on right now to really predict, too early on often to really predict what the outcome of this, all of these events are going to be leading to the primaries and the caucuses. Second group of he calls the Tea Party populist conservatives. They include Ted Cruz, Paul Rand, Ben Carson, names that are familiar to you, I suspect. Ben Carson probably the least familiar and probably the least known of many of the candidates who seem to be declaring themselves for the Republican nomination. He is a former pediatric surgeon, a Republican, and perhaps what makes him stand out from some of the other candidates, aside from being a physician, is that he's also an African American. The social, cultural, and evangelical conservatives make up, again, familiar names: Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, Bobby Jindal, and in terms of another fourth category, what people call secular conventional conservatives. You can go back and look at Charlie Cook's article on this. He has a regular column with the National Journal, to see more detail about what these categories mean. But they include individuals that are becoming more and more well-known to us: Scott Walker, Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, Mike Pence, John Kasich, Rick Snyder, John Bolton. John Bolton is a former UN ambassador under George H.W. Bush to the United Nations, and an individual whose name has popped up on any one of a number of occasions. The also mentioned by the chattering class, again, just to make the pot even larger, throw some more possibilities in there, include Rick Snyder, who's the governor of Michigan, Lindsey Graham, senator of South Carolina, Peter King, a New York congressman, George Pataki, former governor from New York, Jim Gilmore, ex-governor of Virginia, Bob Ehrlich. It can go on and on and on and on. And subsequently, it often is simply, if you look at the leaders in the polls in a year to 2 years back, in some cases 3 years in advance, in many cases the polls start operating literally the day after the last presidential election. you'll see increasingly as the pool of candidates increase that it becomes in some ways harder to really narrow down that field. We can certainly do that here. We know in some cases who the real long shots are. If I were to pick leaders really right now, something that I'm very hesitant to do, but at least if we're looking at polling data right now, and if it has any credibility, then probably the two individuals who are leading the pack in a number of ways are Bush and Scott Walker, and they're followed by Senator Cruz and Senator Paul. Now, again, all I'm doing is speculating on this. Some recent polls that I looked at indicate, for example, that overall Bush right now is struggling really with positive polls. He has a -11 rating, which means that if you subtract his minuses, people who are not favorable toward him, from his positives, people who are favorable, you get a minus rating. Even Scott Walker, who's gotten a tremendous amount of publicity in recent months, has a -1 rating. You might want to compare this to President Obama, who has a +1, Hillary Clinton, who has a +8. Obviously, these are favorable. Favorables are stronger than the negatives. And former President Clinton, who's +30. We'll come back to this very shortly, in part because one of the things we were talking about is how we think about things retrospectively. What about the election themes themselves? 20 months ahead of the election. In no particular order, I'm going to really talk about a number of these. Please keep in mind, really, that this is a really very brief presentation, and I'm kind of moving very rapidly through a number of factors and obviously leaving a lot of the meat and details out. It's one of the reasons I'm looking forward to the question and answer period after this and the opportunity perhaps to explore some of the things that you're interested in more detail. But what are some of the themes and focuses? Certainly in 20 months ahead of time, the issues are very hard to predict in terms of which ones are going to be relevant, not only in the primaries and caucuses of 2016, but obviously in the election, which is roughly about 20 months off. What issues are people going to be thinking about then? Things change rapidly. If you were to make a list now, it probably would include issues like immigration, Afghanistan, Department of Defense spending, climate control, executive power, tax cuts at the federal and state level, social issues like gay marriage, the Common Core, the educational issue that is taking forefront in the Republican race, and I think an issue that probably does stand out and will be probably relevant 20 months from now, we can say at least somewhat relevant, income inequality and the what's called the opportunity gap. These are issues that seem to be themes that are going to be used throughout the campaign, income inequality and the opportunity gap. But even an issue that we would have thought about a year ago as being part of the campaign in 2016, presidential campaign, the Affordable Care Act. It may be questionable at this point whether it is even going to be an issue on the table in 2016 presidential elections, although again, if we were reading the newspapers and following the polls a year ago, we would have thought that this was the case. Why would this be questionable? Well, for one, the Affordable Care Act is slowly, it appears at least in terms of the reports that are coming out, not just from Washington, but from elsewhere, that it's slowly but surely filling up in terms of more participants, more individuals are able to negotiate the process. Whether this stays and remains, given some of the gaps that have existed in the past, obviously is going to be questionable. But there's another major reason that may be off the screen, and that is the Supreme Court is considering a case which will have a significant impact as to whether the Affordable Care Act is going to be a tool, really, for national health care. You should be following that case as much as possible. Your students should be following, rather, as much as possible. But again, picking the issues is not easy. What about the questions of ideology 20 months in advance? And in part, what I'm asking more than anything else is, how conservative will the public be? What voter attraction will be based on ideology? I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes because there's some interesting data and outcomes regarding the role of ideology and what its impact might be. I think an important issue is dark money, and when I talk about dark money, I'm particularly talking about PAC dark money. Dark money is fundamentally something we call 501c4 money. 501c4 money is money that can be collected by a nonprofit institution that focuses on social welfare issues. That's its major focus, and it can, though, and does come out in support of particular issues. The key to dark money is, in the 501c4 system of collecting it, is that any particular PAC can collect money, and they do not have to report the amount of the donations from individuals nor the names of individuals in a 501c4 report. This is critical because many individuals want to contribute to campaigns, but they don't necessarily want the names associated with that contribution. What a 501c4 does is it allows institutions like, well, the Koch Freedom Partners is a good example. The Koch Freedom Partners is as you probably are very familiar with, the Koch brothers are a conservative brothers who now plan to spend on the 2016 election about $889 million of contributions to Senate campaigns and the presidential campaigns. They do this through a network of 300 what we would call super wealthy donors who contribute to make up this $889 million. Koch brothers also contribute their own funds to this. The Freedom Partners is a 501c4, so anybody making a contribution to it can be assured that their name will not be revealed and the amount of money they give will not be revealed, while at the same time that money can be used for advertisements promoting certain issues, not necessarily naming a specific candidate in support of those issues, but pushing the issues. And frequently it is very easy to figure out who that money is supporting. What's important and interesting about this dark money is that it's probably going to exceed either the Republican or the amount of money that either the Republican or Democratic parties are going to be able to raise and spend on the 2016 election. The amount of money that's being spent literally simply by the Koch Freedom Brothers Political Action Committee. What this means, in effect, is that the role of political parties may be reduced, and we may see this as going forward happening increasingly. And that power and that influence that parties lend themselves to elections, which has been declining for a number of years as we move towards candidate-centered campaigns, that power is going to be replaced by large, effective, and very well-financed super political action committees that use dark money like 501c4 money, but also other types of monies, 527 money, a variety of other ways of collecting and putting money together, which is of concern. Now, I gave you an example of the Koch Freedom Partners. This is obviously true also on the liberal side. George Soros is a name that's familiar probably to many of you, a millionaire who's contributed to many Democratic causes. Tom Sayer is another individual, a multimillionaire who's contributed millions of dollars, particularly to environmental issues. What is clear one way or the other, though, out of this is that conservative super PACs spending dark money have been much more successful in raising funds than the liberal groups have been. I should point out one other thing that I just want to make you aware of, and that has to do with the fact that we're seeing this money also being spent increasingly on state election judges. And I think this is an interesting issue to present to students, that there are 39 states that elect at least some of their judges, and in those states, increasingly we're seeing both outside money but PAC money to try and influence the outcome of that. This is particularly so 2 years ago, in 2014, 2012, in elections, judicial elections in Florida, where outside funding was used to try and defeat 3 incumbent Supreme Court judges in Florida who were running for re-election and who were regarded potentially as too progressive or too liberal, and groups came in to try, in effect, have an impact by spending money mostly against those particular candidates. Now, we can't go too far with the role that PAC money is spent. Impact on spending sometimes is not, by PACs is considerable money, does not always work out. Carl Rove, a name that also may be familiar to you, a confidant and advisor to President George W. Bush, had a very powerful PAC that targeted a number of U.S. Senate races in 2014 and was pretty unsuccessful. So we have dark money as an important force. Very quickly going through these, because we are running to some extent short on time, I think the Latino vote is obviously going to be an important vote. It's now and in the future as we begin to see particularly a move towards minority state population shifting. We're going to be seeing over the very near term and over the long term increasingly communities in which there is what we call majority-minority population. California, for example, and New Mexico by 2006 had a majority of its population was Latino. California is moving in that direction and should reach it by 2016. There are literally somewhere in the order of 20 states that between now and 2060 are very likely to move into majority-minority status, where the Latino population is the central population. Latinos are actually not the fastest-growing voting bloc in the country. Actually, Asian Americans are, but Latinos are in such much larger numbers, and it's clear that their impact on not just the 2016 election, but future elections is going to be very important. And that we can predict 20 months in advance. Party identification is very important in the context of predicting outcomes for the 2016 election. I have a story, a very quick story to tell you. I was talking to an acquaintance of mine on my campus once, and back in 2008, and at some point he had indicated that he was voting for at that time Senator Obama. I asked him when he had made that decision, and he said he made that decision 40 years ago. What he meant by that, and it's probably pretty obvious, is that he was clearly a lifetime Democrat. He also had a strong belief and a feeling that it was important to have a black man or a black woman eventually become president of the United States. When he said that he made the decision to vote for Obama 40 years ago, he obviously was not being literal. But you could have predicted 40 years ago that if this occasion came, party identification would rule. And that's why I say it's very important. We know that going into any given election, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 85% of voters have made up their minds about how they're going to vote, and a good reason and evidence indicates that party identification is a very strong and important component of that. What other factors are important? Well, I have the Supreme Court listed there, and I've already talked about 4 or 5 Supreme Court cases that are really important. They're important not only for the 2006 or the 16 election, as I indicate, but for future elections as well. To the degree to which they allow funding of elections, particularly, and speaking for the most part at the federal level, although it has a trickle-down effect to the states, to the extent that we free up money, increasingly the private sector will be, in terms of collecting and providing funding for elections, will supplant the public sector. I use that term very loosely, meaning political parties, candidates, as the major funder of elections. And that is something for some people to be concerned about, others really just simply to make sure they're watching closely. Spending, for example, the Koch brothers spending close to $1 billion on the 2016 elections, that is the Senate and House elections and the presidency. That's a lot of money, obviously, and if they persist in that, and if other groups, including both conservative and liberal groups, continue to collect monies like this, it'll be interesting to try and sort out and parse out who's having influence on these elections. The only points that I have remaining that I want to talk very quickly about are polarization of Congress. The question is, and we'll come back to that very shortly, whether polarization is going to affect perspectives in terms of the Republicans who control the House and Senate. Equally so is the role of President Obama. Presidential popularity is very closely, for example, associated and correlated with Senate outcome, and it will be important to watch and see whether President Obama's popularity or diminished popularity has an impact on the 2016 elections. I make this point very concretely that what we're talking about, I want you to keep in mind, is everything that I said. This is not a science. It's not a prediction on my part, just a framework for conversation and perhaps for your students, that these are some of the issues and things that we're going to talk about. So what else do we want to quickly talk about in the next 5 or so minutes? Very quickly, kind of a quick and dirty look at the House and Senate elections. There was some concern that the Republicans might hurt themselves in 2016 from a possible shutdown relative to the Homeland Security issue, funding the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, and that was avoided, at least for the time being. What we found in the past really is, though, that sequesters and shutdowns have had, for example, relatively little impact on the 2014 election than they might have. Republicans have to worry, I think, in a number of ways, and not just in terms of the image they present, and I'm going to argue that they're not going to lose the Senate or House in 2016, but the image that they present and how it may affect the presidential elections. Boehner, one speaker, with just 216 Republican votes. That is not good. in terms of taking over winning Speaker of the House. Boehner also has a very kind of limited relationship with McConnell, Senator McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, Republican majority leader. They don't communicate very well with each other, and that has probably caused problems between the Republican parties in both houses. The Republicans also have 24 seats up in 2016 in the House of Representatives. The Democrats have 10. I'm sorry, Senate. 24 Senate seats in 2016, 10 Democratic seats are up. 7 Republican seats of those 24 in states in which Obama won in 2012. I want to look at those states. None of the Democrats seeking election are in states that Mitt Romney won, so that's somewhat relevant. And we know there's a relationship between the Senate vote and the presidential vote. There's a correlation between Senate and presidential results, and it's been increasing. So we want to look at that closely. A case can be made. There's no case can be made, I'll argue, for the Democrats in 2016 getting either the House or the Senate. Having said that, they probably will win both because I said this to you. But the more serious analysis of this suggests that it's going to be very hard for them, if not impossible, as I put down. I don't think that's a tough call. It's very, very unlikely that Democrats at this point in time will win the House of Representatives. And probably it's much more realistic for them to be shooting as far ahead in terms of regaining these houses as 2022. And I say that because it comes after the 2020 census redistricting, and it is possible at that particular time, depending on a whole bunch of considerations, that they may be able to be districted in such a way as to get some enough favorable redistricting so that they're able to win some of those relatively limited number of seats that are competitive, and perhaps introduce some more competitive seats. Remember, I said earlier that only about 30 to 40 House seats in any given election are really regarded as competitive. I'm not going to go into this right now. Some of you might want to ask a question about it, but a lot is going to be depending on what's happening at the state level relative to redistricting in 2020, and how well the Democrats or Republicans do in being able to control the state legislatures. This is important and very important because it's the state legislatures in the end that are going to be controlling how new districts will be drawn. If a state controls both houses, if the Republican Party controls both houses in a particular state, which they do in a significant number of states right now, then they're the ones who are going to control the redistricting of that state. Again, it's not a tough call. Having said all of this, it's very unlikely that the Democrats are going to be able to win the House and Senate, but obviously still worth watching. The presidency may be an entirely different question in terms of competitiveness. It's evident that the Republicans in Congress, in order to avoid paralysis and to be much more effective, have to really, from their perspective, they have to win. They must win the presidency in 2016. The reasons for that are pretty evident over the last 2 congressional sessions. Boehner faces a Republican caucus that has not been unified. The Freedom Caucus, which is a caucus within the Republican caucus, has about, roughly speaking, 50-plus members. We're really not sure exactly, who have been very, very effective in frustrating Boehner regarding any one of a number of policy issues that he and some of the more conservative but traditional conservative Republicans in the House have wanted to foster. I said I'd come back to this topic, so I want to talk about it a little bit, and that is the problems that the Republicans may have with moderates and independents in terms of the 2016 election. The fact of the matter is that in 2012, about 2/3 of the presidential election year voters in 2012 didn't call themselves conservatives. We have a strong image of a very strong conservative community in this country, and indeed about 35% of the public in 2012 regards themselves as conservatives. About 25% consider themselves liberals, but 41% consider themselves moderates. This is a key factor because the Republicans have not done very well relative to attracting moderate votes, certainly in the most recent presidential race. There was a 15% gap between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama in terms of winning over what we call, or what individuals self-label themselves as moderates. And so one of the things clearly that the Republicans are going to have to pay attention to in terms of the message they project through whatever issues, positions they take, is how this will affect basically the moderate and the independent vote, which are going to be key, obviously, in the 2000 election. The Democrats are in a different situation entirely. The major problem, I would argue, is something that I call and others have called the working class whites problem. Over the last 10 years, the Democrats have taken a serious hit, losing the support of working class whites. And this presents a short-term but also a long-term problem for the Democratic Party that they have to pay attention to. In addition to that, in terms of campaign funding, they stand at a disadvantage, generally speaking, particularly relative to PAC funding and Super PAC funding. Super PAC funding, just to come back and reiterate, is basically funding that takes place independent of the candidates and independent of the political party organizations. And the Republicans have been doing a much better job of fundraising. I've suggested that we may be seeing a major paradigm change, a shift to which PACs become the major funders of elections and not necessarily the candidates raising their own funds on their own or the political parties. If this is the case, and if the Democrats are not doing well, 2016 and the future don't bode well for them. And I think finally, really, in terms of just a comment about the Democratic power, I simply very quickly say that Obama's approval ratings are highly correlated to the Senate outcome have to be talked about. In conclusion, again, kind of running out of time, some historical challenges that we can talk about in terms of question and answers, and I can come back really and talk about some of these in more detail, but the bottom line is that there are a whole bunch of historical factors, not conclusive, but would argue really that both parties, depending on how you look at the issues and problems, have advantages and disadvantages. And we can talk about that in the question and answer period if you have any. What about my own conclusions about all of that, what I've said so far? I'm suggesting really in many ways we live in a permanent campaign situation. So yes, what goes on 2, 3, or 4 years before the actual election is silly, but it is permanent. Individuals come into the system, whether it be Congress or state legislators, and start campaigning from, as I point out, almost day one. Day one is the day after they're elected. They start campaigning once again. In addition to that, day one for some individuals may be the day they were born or the day they get out of college or whatever, and they make a decision they're going to start campaigning over the next 10 to 15 years in order to win election to the Senate, the House, the state legislature, or whatever. I think there are a number of 10 states that you should be looking at, that your students should be looking at. I think 10 key states in 2016. Again, I can deliver this to you in a different format, but they include Wisconsin, Nevada, Florida, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Virginia, and Ohio. Please excuse this quick delivery, because I do want to get to questions and whatever. But these are states, these are really the 10 states where the action is. The remaining 40, more or less, are pretty much, we have a pretty good idea of how they're going to turn out. We can also talk about in question and answers the question of turnout, super PACs and spending. I've talked to quite a bit already. I think time and recognition and favorability are important. We're looking at polls right now in which recognition rates are really relatively low. Hillary Clinton has an 89% familiarity rate. Jeb Bush has only a 68%. And this is going to change over time, obviously, as the campaign extends itself. It's the reason why polling right now is so tenuous, because a lot of candidates who may be successful candidates in the future simply are not, at this point in time, very well known by anybody. And the economy is obviously, it always has an important role in presidential elections in recent years, and I think particularly the issue of income inequality. So I think what I'm going to do is stop right now and leave us at least a few minutes for some questions. Tony will indicate to you also that I'd be also more than happy to respond to questions that you might have if you email them. So I'm going to turn this back to Tony.
Thank you, Alan. We really appreciate that. We do have a number of questions that are being asked. The first question is by Dr. Ito, who asks, how can the Obama administration policies impact the 2016 presidential elections? I know you touched upon this a little bit during your talk, Alan, but maybe can you go into a little bit further detail?
Well, the issues certainly, there's some key issues. As I said, the Affordable Care Act is one that one would have thought about a year ago having a significant impact, less likely now. I think some of the issues that may have an impact, and again we're talking 20 months away, certainly foreign policy in a way that we might not normally expect in most presidential races is going to have an impact. Policies going forward in not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but also policies around the world, how we're perceived of, how the Obama administration is perceived of. What is going to be happening in Iran? These relative to our alliance with Israel and President Obama's desire to bring about some kind of extended treaty with Iran, at least over the next 10 years. These are foreign policy issues that are clearly important. We know the most important domestic issue is generally the economy. I talked about income inequality, which is going to be an issue that I'm sure the Republicans and Democrats alike are going to raise as a major issue. The spread between incomes between low income and high income is just widens and widens and widens. So I think the economy remains an important issue. We'll see again about health care. We probably can go down and look at a number of other things that may be relevant. Budgetary issues, deficit spending will certainly be raised by the Republicans as a challenge to any Democratic candidate. All of these have, in many respects, their roots in President Obama's policies over the last 6.5 years and are likely to play at least some role in the 2016 election. I should point out that the election rate for a party, that is the third election after two successful, Democrat or Republican serving 2 successful terms, the ability for that party to maintain and win the next election after that is very slim, and not very often does this happen just as a matter of precedent.
Thank you. Dr. Tamara Young has a question. How do you view the recent media attention to the issue of single women as a coveted demographic group to court, and do you believe they are a key group to garner a positive outcome in 2016?
They are, obviously. We can talk about a lot of groups. We used to talk about soccer moms as one point in the election process since 2000, in which these were suburban, traditional suburban housewives who were becoming more active and issue-oriented relative to a number of important issues to them as being an important force. Single women, since that population has increased and remains fairly large within the context of the population, is important. So I think the key here really is, as an important group, how you parse out the kinds of policies and issues that single women are going to have. They certainly have an awful lot to do with the economy and what their salaries are going to be, and salary equity, for example, with males. But in addition to that, other issues that remain very important. How would the Affordable Care Act affect really single women in terms of their need to have medical care at a reasonable price? Remember, single women are tending, obviously, have a one-income family, so their resources are less. If we include among single women with families, with children, then there are a whole variety of other kinds of issues regarding education as a case in point that would be important to this group. So I think that there are going to be a number of issues that you target in a way shotgun to everybody who's in all constituents in this particular election, but I think single women will be seen really as critical and important, and I think this will probably become evident if we have the first woman running for the presidency from a major party, that is Hillary Clinton, whether that issue will be heightened, particularly among the media. The media are looking for issues like this as important. I think this is an important issue, but they're looking at it simply as an issue that may bring tension between the Republican and Democratic Party.
Wonderful. So we have time for 2 more questions. If anybody else has any questions, our queue is empty right now, so happy if there's anybody else that has any other questions at this point. We'll wait a moment or so.
Sure. While we're waiting for that, I'd simply like to emphasize again one of the things that I'm interested in. I mean, as Tony pointed out, I love writing. I love writing books. I enjoy the process and I enjoy research. But teaching is my real love. I came into this some 40-plus years ago wanting to be able to teach. And I think really, and what's one of the reasons that we wrote a book on American government is that it's my favorite class. The American government class remains my favorite class. I'm the most senior member of my department, but that's the class I really want to teach every single semester. And I think what we have to do as we approach this kind of topic and many other topics is remind our students how complex really all of this is, that there are no simple answers, and that understanding the campaign process, and particularly why it starts as early as it does, is often confounding. And there are a lot of variables in the mix that bring this about. I think it makes your job and my job hard. In fact, at times I think very hard. But that is trying to explain the importance of an election long in advance of when that election will take place. But we obviously, I think, have an obligation to do that. And I think what we can do, obviously, is help set up a structure for our students in which they can think about, in some ways, perhaps how silly it is to be starting this discussion so early, but at the same time training themselves really to think about the complexities of an election and really how they are indeed, as I suggested earlier, in flux for a long period of time leading up really to the actual election itself. So my hat's off.
We have one.
Go ahead, Tony. I'm sorry.
No worries. I was going to say we have one last question, and it's by Dr. Tamara Young again. Any states that might reach the tipping point in 2016? If not, what states are next? You mentioned majority-minority states, but some might tip without being a majority-minority state.
Well, we have basically, there are two categories that we talk about when we talk about majority and minority states. Those that will have majority-minority population and those that will have a majority-minority voting population. So just very quickly to look at this, for example, in terms of eligible, let's just focus just on eligible votes. So I said New Mexico and California both will have majority-minority, will be tipping by 2000, already are by 2016. Texas by 2019. Nevada by 2030. And I can go down that list, and what's important really is to look at these states. Texas and California are the two largest states in the nation. They're going to be, by the end of 2020, both of them will be majority-minority states. That adds a different kind of calculus when you think about elections, because certainly Latinos are not an homogeneous group. They represent many different groups from different countries with different issues and different problems. But they also share some common problems as well, as campaigners have found, particularly in these states. And so I think that we're going to see clearly a rapid move towards this. It's expected that by the year 2052, the United States will have a majority-minority eligible population. By 2044, some 8 years earlier, in terms of the whole population, we will have a majority-minority population. So this is an issue to watch very, very carefully. It's an issue, particularly the Latino vote in 2016. And going forward, I think it's a critical and important issue to watch as well. So these are good questions.
So Alan, which state after Texas did you mention?
I mentioned Nevada, which has been actually a state that's been in the mix now for some time relative to presidential elections, but it has a fairly large Latino population. After that, Maryland comes up in 2031, Georgia in 2036, Alaska in 2037, although it's not going to be a Latino minority necessarily. Arizona, again, another state, not surprisingly. These are all states that already have significant Latino populations, but their participation rates have not necessarily been high for any one of a number of reasons. New Jersey, Florida, New York, Louisiana, Illinois, the state that I am in, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Virginia, Connecticut, Delaware, North Carolina, and Colorado. These are all states that are on the radar over the next, roughly speaking, 40 years. To be moving towards majority-minority populations, and that changes the mix in the population. It obviously changes the mix for the election process.
Great. Well, our webinar has come to an end. I want to thank Dr. Gitelson for his time today. We really appreciate that. I want to thank all of our participants and attendees for joining us today as well. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with a short webinar survey at the end. And we would very much appreciate it if you could fill it out so we can improve our webinars going forward. On another note, we are recording this webinar, and we will provide additional information as to where the posted recording will live. So we will definitely follow up with you on that. Once again, thank you so much for your time, and a big thank you to Dr. Gitelson for presenting today. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me, Tony Mathias, or Dr. Gitelson directly. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye now.